This is Principles of Ecosystem Ecology. Chapter 8, Plant Nutrient Use. Nutrients are elements besides carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that plants require for growth. Nutrient absorption, use, and loss by plants are key steps in the mineral cycling of ecosystems. This chapter describes the factors that regulate nutrient cycling through vegetation. The authors state that nutrient supply constrains the productivity of the biosphere. Now, plants need light, they need water, and a whole host of other factors, but it's nutrients that are the primary constraint on the productivity of plants worldwide. Nutrient limitation is widespread. Ecosystems throughout the globe have nutrients supplied less than they're demanded by plants, and if we increase the nutrient supply, productivity will increase throughout the world. This applies to both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So in a terrestrial ecosystem, if we go and apply nutrients, such as this grassland here, in an area like this, and compare it to areas that do not have those nutrients applied, productivity goes up. And we consider this to be limitation of productivity by the resource or the nutrient that was added here. Now, aquatic systems are also limited by nutrients. We talked about Lake Erie, how it's experiencing algal blooms these days that are unprecedented due to runoff from agriculture from the Maumee River. And here's a relatively new satellite photo of the lake showing the input of nutrients into Lake Erie, its dispersion through the lake, but then really the concentration of greater productivity next to the source of elevated nutrients. Now, in order to understand nutrient limitation and also nutrient use, we have to think about how plants acquire nutrients from the soils and the environment around them, how they're used by plants, and eventually how they're lost. The authors provide a focal issue for thinking about the importance of nutrients. Agricultural and urban runoff of nutrients has increased algal production of many lakes and streams, reducing their water quality and recreational value. So for terrestrial ecosystems on the land, we know that nutrients are important, but there's many downstream consequences for there being excess nutrients in agricultural systems and urban systems, for example. One of the key things that humans do to alter the functioning of the biosphere is to alter the availability of nutrients. And essentially, we fertilize a lot of ecosystems, both purposefully and inadvertently. This graph here shows the responsive grain yield in different cereal crops to fertilizer additions for different parts of the world. And you can see that some parts of the world fertilize more on average than others. So on the x-axis we have fertilizer use, and on the y-axis we have grain yield, which is grams per meter squared. So these studies were all during the Green Revolution, which was a time when people really focused in on increasing agricultural production to meet growing food demand. If you draw one curve, so this works across time and across sites. So India, Australia, United States, United Kingdom, Japan. And if you were to put this all on one curve, for example, you would see that as fertilizer use increases, grain yield, the marginal increase in grain yield declines, though doesn't necessarily show signs of saturation. You can also see that within a country, for example the US, the amount of fertilizer use increased greatly between 1950 and 1974. Now this fertilizer use here is shown in grams per meter squared, and actually within the US, even for a cornfield, it's hard to get above 20 grams per meter squared. And so these rates of addition above 20 grams per meter squared are extremely high. Still, what this shows is that there are different amounts of fertilizer that are being used, or at least this paper when it was written in 1980, among the different parts of the world and over time. Now, the consequences of all that nutrient use we'll talk about, and we'll think about how plants acquire those nutrients that are being used and use them, but also what the consequences are of them being lost from agricultural systems. Now, when we fertilize ecosystems, and also when we look at what nutrients are most limiting, first and foremost, it seems to me nitrogen is one of the more important elements that are limiting plant productivity on a global scale. But phosphorus is also commonly limiting, and we're going to talk about some of the differences between nitrogen and phosphorus. And thirdly, tends to be potassium. If you go to any bag of fertilizer in your hardware store, for example, it usually has numbers that represent N, P, and K, and many of the fertilizers have a balance of N, P, and K that we would add domestically, for example. So those are the three that are most commonly limiting, but other elements can limit productivity too. There are consequences of adding nutrients to an ecosystem beyond the direct effects in the local ecosystem. When those nutrients are lost, often they enter the water, and there are downstream consequences for the addition of those nutrients to terrestrial ecosystems. For example, just like fertilizing a terrestrial ecosystem or your lawn is going to increase the productivity of that lawn and you'll get more plant growth, the same thing happens in aquatic systems. This here is a relatively famous experiment that shows stimulation of lake productivity by phosphorus addition. This line right here is an experimental curtain. So essentially, they took a giant shower curtain and divided this lake in half. And on one half of the lake, they added phosphorus. And the other half of the lake was left as a control. Phosphorus addition stimulated the production of algae and a nitrogen-fixing cyanobacterium, which transformed this relatively clear lake into a big green soup. Now, one of the consequences of this additional productivity are fish kills. And in many places where you have eutrophication, the depletion of oxygen that's caused by the decomposition of that additional productivity reduces the oxygen levels to where it's suffocating for fish. And it's not uncommon in areas that had been fertilized and we see excess productivity to end up with fish kills due to a depletion in oxygen within those waters. So pea green soup, lots of bacteria, although they produce oxygen in the immediate vicinity when they decompose, that's going to lower the oxygen levels and that's going to kill fish. But also some of these cyanobacteria and other phytoplankton are directly toxic, and that also can have negative consequences. So as a focal issue, some of those questions to think about are, why are some lakes more sensitive to nutrient inputs than others? And thinking about how much nutrient can be put into a lake before we see radical changes in the functioning of that lake is a very important question. Which nutrients have the greatest long-term impact on lake productivity? And how can these inputs from the land be reduced in managed landscapes? So there's somewhere on the order of 22 elements beyond carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that are essential to most plant growth. But which of these 22 are going to be the most important? And we've talked about N and P and K as being important, but how do we know which of these are most important? And is it one of the other 19, for example? If it is, once we figure out which is the most limiting and which has the greatest effect when it's added, what can we do to reduce the amount of N or phosphorus or potassium that runs off a terrestrial ecosystem and then enters into the water? What are the consequences of nutrient deposition on unmanaged ecosystems? So this is a question that I've added here because their focal issue mostly was on aquatic systems. But what we'll learn is that from a given ecosystem, it's true that some of those nutrients can enter the waterway and then enter into lakes and cause downstream effects, but there's also downwind effects. And some of those nutrients, especially nitrogen, can volatilize, be turned into a gaseous form, and then eventually rain down onto ecosystems. And terrestrial ecosystems can be downwind of high places where nitrogen is added at high rates, and cause drastic changes in the functioning of that system, just like we can see drastic changes in the aquatic systems.